Chapter 9. If you'd like to turn over there, we will get started with that in a moment. We are studying through the signs in the Gospel of John. I think most of our audience here tonight looks like you've been here at some point in time for some of these lessons. And so this thing seems like it's stuck for some reason. It's not moving forward on me. There it is. There we go. It's unjammed now. All right. We've been working through these 7 signs in the Gospel of John. We've looked at Jesus turning water into wine in John 2, Jesus healing the nobleman's son in John 4. We looked at Jesus healing the lame man at the pool of Bethesda in John 5. We looked last week at Jesus feeding the 5,000 as well as him walking on the water. And we're going to take a look at Jesus healing the blind man near the pool of Siloam in John chapter 9. John chapter 9. And then we'll take a look at Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead here in a week. This is what's called the festival cycle. We've already gone over this, and so I'm not going to jump into it too much, but I'm just going to kind of summarize some of the gaps just with this one quote, because we're skipping from John 6 into John chapter 9, which means we're skipping over 2 chapters. So I'm just going to let him summarize what happens in those chapters. It says in John 7 and 8, this is Andreas Kostenberger. He says, John 7 and 8 jointly show Jesus initially delaying, but then going to the feast in Jerusalem in John 7. His brothers kind of encourage him to do that. And eventually he goes. John 7, 9 and 10. He appears in public, both at the midway point and on the final day of the feast, which is documented in John 7, 13 and John 7, 37. After this, Jesus engages in a second teaching cycle, which culminates in his declaration that he pre-existed Abraham. He mentions that in John chapter 8. And then with almost no transition, chapter 9, verse 1 says, as he passed by, Jesus encounters a man who had been born blind. And the healing recorded in John 9 is followed by the Good Shepherd discourse in John 10. So we kind of looked at the bread, Jesus multiplying bread and fish in John 6, and then the bread of life discourse follows that. Well, there's also a discourse really that follows this miracle. It's in John 10. A lot of times we separate John 9 from John 10, but really John 10 just follows right on the heels of John chapter 9. Take a look at the map work for just a moment, because I want you to see a lot of things have happened in the other Gospels chronologically between what we looked at in John 6 and then what we're about to look at in John chapter 9. So if you're trying to wrap your head around what all's happened in between the things John decides to document, this might give you kind of an idea. There you are. All right. So John 6, you've got the third Passover mentioned. And then you have the 5,000 that are fed by the seashore that's documented in John 6. It's also in all 4 Gospels. Jesus walks on the water. We already noted that. And then you have the miracles that are on the plain of Gennesaret, which Mark chapter 6 also documents in 53 through 56. Now, turn the page on the map work here, and you'll notice several other things happen before we ever even get to John chapter 9. Jesus is working and preaching in the region of Tyre and Sidon, which Matthew chapter 15 documents. You have a deaf mute healed in Decapolis in Matthew 15. You have the feeding of the 4,000, which Mark chapter 8 documents. The blind man, another different blind man is healed in Mark chapter 8. He talks about building his church in Matthew 16 as he's there at Caesarea Philippi. The transfiguration occurs in Matthew chapter 17. The epileptic boy is healed in Matthew chapter 17. There's a coin that's taken from the fish for the temple tax in Matthew 17. In Jerusalem, he would have celebrated the Feast of the Tabernacles in John 7. There was a woman that was talked to who had been caught in adultery in John 8. And then you get to the blind man who's healed in John chapter 9. So there's a lot of other things that fill in the gaps as you read through the other Gospels that, just if you're trying to follow along chronologically, might be helpful. All right, let's take a look at the text. John chapter 9. I'm just going to read this entire text to you. I think it's an interesting text. It's one of the most entertaining gospel texts, I think, to read because of all the personalities that are involved in it. But we're just going to read through it, and then we're going to ask some of these questions. It says, as he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. And as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva, and then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud, and said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam, which means sent. And so he went and washed and came back seeing. The neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, but he is like him. He kept saying, I am the man. And so they said to him, then how were your eyes opened? He answered, the man called Jesus made mud and anointed my eyes and said to me, go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed and received my sight. They said to him, where is he? He said, I do not know. And they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. Now it was a Sabbath day when Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees again asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes, and I washed, and I see. And some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So they said again to the blind man, what do you say about him, since he has opened your eyes? He said, he is a prophet. And the Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight, until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight, and asked them, is this your son, who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son, and that he was born blind, but how he now sees we do not know, nor do we know who opened his eyes. Ask him. He's of age. He will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And therefore his parents said, he is of age, ask him. So for the second time, they called the man who had been blind and said to him, give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered, whether he is a sinner, I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. And they said to him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples? And they reviled him, saying, you are his disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from. The man answered, why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered him, you were born in utter sin, and would you teach us? And they cast him out. And Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I came into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, are we also blind? And Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say we see, your guilt remains. All right, you got 14 more verses, though, that I want you to see in chapter 10. I want you to connect chapter 10 to what you read in chapter 9. So he goes on, verse 1, truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs in by another way, that man is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the gatekeeper opens. The sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has brought out all his own, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. This figure of speech Jesus used with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them. So Jesus again said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not listen to them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and he will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. And he who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he's a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. I am the good shepherd. I know my own, and my own know me, just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. What do you think he's talking about when he talks about the hired hand and the thieves and the robbers and the hirelings?
Pharisees, the Jewish leaders.
Pharisees, yeah. And so I want you to see, Jesus gets rather blunt with how he feels about the Pharisees who have just kicked this man out of the synagogue in chapter 10. And he's contrasting the way that they've treated him and how people really don't want to follow them because they really don't care about people. They care about their position. They care about their money. They care about their popularity, their influence. They do not care about people. And he says, you're not a real shepherd. Real shepherds care about the people. He is the good shepherd. Jesus is demonstrating he cares about people, and they are demonstrating we could care less about this guy. We're using him as a tool, and that's their only purpose for him. And so John 10 follows on the heels of John 9, because, and it's important to know that because understanding John 10 requires us kind of going back to John 9 and getting a better picture of what's happened there. All right, so you take a look at the questions, and question number 1 says this: our reactions to others say a lot about us. In John 9, you have a blind beggar, and he is the conversation piece. So how do the following individuals react to this man who was born blind? How do the disciples, first of all, react to this man who was born blind?
Inquisitive.
They're inquisitive. They kind of use him as a topic for a theological discussion, right? Why is he born blind, Jesus? Did he sin, or did his parents sin? They're wanting to just kind of use him as an investigative tool, sort of. They're very inquisitive about why he's blind. Why do good people suffer? Why do innocent people suffer? They're really asking the question that a lot of people ask. That's one of the top question that skeptics ask about. Why should I believe in a God who allows good, decent people to suffer? So Jesus, tell us why he's suffering. Did he do something wrong? Did he deserve this? Did his parents do something wrong? Are they being punished for this? They're asking that question. They're looking at it from that angle. All right, so Jesus, what does he see? He sees someone in need. Yes, Joni?
He sees someone the opportunity to show God's power and tells the disciples this is why he was born.
Yep. Good. He sees an opportunity to show God's power and to demonstrate to his disciples another opportunity to demonstrate who he is, which is one of the purposes of the Gospel of John and one of the purposes of the signs of Jesus. All right, how do the neighbors see this guy? Ed?
He also includes them.
Okay.
He said, we must work, not just I.
Good. Yeah, so kind of encouraging them that one day Jesus isn't going to be here as well, so you need to see these things as opportunities to work the works of God. And so he's leading the way in that at this time. All right, so what about the neighbors? How do the neighbors see this?
Befuddled.
What's that?
Befuddled.
Befuddled. They're a little befuddled. Yeah, this looks like the guy. Well, hold on, that's not the guy. That's just his doppelganger. There's just a guy that looks like him. They're just trying to figure out, why is the guy that was blind before, why is he seeing now? So they're just kind of curious, what's going on here? All right, the Pharisees.
Not from God because he didn't keep the Sabbath.
Right, so they see this guy as another opportunity to try to make Jesus look bad. There's no way Jesus could have done this, for one, because Jesus is a sinner, or if he did it, it indicates he's a sinner. Either way, they're just trying to make Jesus look bad for having done this on the Sabbath day. It's just an opportunity for them. Again, we pointed this out during the miracle at the pool of Bethesda too. There's no rejoicing. This guy's been blind from birth. He sees. And the Pharisees come across him and they don't say, hey, you were blind and you see. That's awesome. What did you imagine I looked like when you heard my voice all these years? Am I uglier than you thought I would be? Am I better looking? There's none of that. It's just who opened your eyes. That's all. Who did this? And tell us what he did. Oh, well, he put clay in your eyes. Well, he worked then because he put some spit and some mud together. And because of that, and because he put it on your eyes, he's working, so he's breaking the Sabbath. So it's just an opportunity to trap Jesus. There's no joy. There's no happiness. There's no praise of God. It's just an opportunity to attack Jesus. So his parents.
They really display that more than anyone because this is their own son. And instead of being joyful that he can see, they're more scared of the Jews, and they, in fact, want to distance themselves from their son.
Yeah, to me, that's the saddest one. You're the parents, and you don't seem like you're happy, or if you are happy, you're afraid to tell the Pharisees who did this. It's almost like you're like, well, we can't talk about religion or politics, that would get us in trouble, and so we're just going to stay away from that, and you go ahead and ask him what he thinks. He's of age, he's an adult. And so they just blame, I wouldn't say blame shift, they just evade. They evade the entire topic. They do admit that he's blind, though, so that's helpful because at least they admit, yes, he was born blind. So Merrill Tenney writes this in his commentary. He says, to the disciples, he was a subject for theological analysis. Why should the man be born blind? Could his condition be accounted for by some sin on the part of his parents? The word by which the neighbors characterized the man was beggar. They regarded him as more or less of a nuisance. He was one more mouth to feed, and then they're just befuddled about why this beggar can see. To the Pharisees, this man was only a tool. They evinced not the slightest interest in him, but were eager to employ him as a witness. And Jesus viewed him as a man, personality, who needed his ministrations, an illuminating disclosure of his entire attitude toward humanity. Doesn't see him as a tool, doesn't see him as a beggar, doesn't try to use him, doesn't just see him as a theological prop. He's a human being, and he's a human being who needed help. And Jesus demonstrates his compassion while the rest of the people do not. Now, many will try to discredit the miracles of the Bible. Sometimes we do that because we have an anti-supernatural belief system. And that's just kind of, we have an automatic built-in presupposition, a lot of people, that miracles don't happen. We've been told miracles don't happen, and because miracles don't happen, then we're not going to believe that miracles happen. So notice some of the details in the following passages to give evidence of this man's situation prior to the miracle of Jesus. And it indicates to us why John would have included this in his gospel. So the man's situation, was this just a temporary blindness? No. Verses 1 and 2 says he's born blind. So if you're going to perform a miracle on a blind person, he doesn't do it on somebody who's just temporarily blind or just, got something in his eye. This guy's been blind from birth. His parents confirm it. Okay. Look at verse 8. Do the neighbors realize that he was blind? Yeah, because they say, isn't this the one who sat and begged? And then they're asking in verse 10, how were your eyes open? So they know. So the disciples realize that he's blind. The neighbors realize that he's blind. John 9, verses 18 through 20. You have the parents being questioned. Do the parents admit that he was blind? Yes. So we have confirmation from not only the disciples, not only the neighbors, but also the parents that, yes, we know that this is our son, they say in verse 20, and that he was born blind. But we don't know why he can see now. So you just go ahead and ask him about that. And then John 9, verse 25.
You know whether he was a sinner or not, but the man healed him.
Okay. He talks about the one who healed him, that he must be legit because I was blind. So he, through his own words, admits, I was blind, but now I see. And then verse 30, the man answered and said, it's a marvelous thing that you do not know where he's from, but he has opened my eyes. So 2 times he affirms that he was blind and his eyes were now opened. And so you have multiple witnesses here as John works through the story that would confirm that indeed this was a blind man. So this is a legit miracle. So this blind man, though, is confronted with skepticism, and that's what we would expect if somebody you knew that had been blind their whole life was all of a sudden seeing. You would kind of wonder, am I seeing things? What happened here? Did you bring in somebody else? Are you messing with me? There's skepticism, I think, when we learn about miracles. And so he's confronted with skepticism, intense interrogation. He's attacked because of the miracle that occurs to him. But even in the face of persecution, do you see his faith strengthening as you work through this story? How does he describe Jesus in John 9 and verse 11? A man called Jesus. A man, just another human being called Jesus. All right. How does he describe Jesus in John 9 and verse 17? A prophet. So now he's not just a man, he's called a prophet. So they ask him, what do you say about him because he opened your eyes? Well, he's a prophet. There must be something different about him. John 9 and verse 30. How does he describe Jesus in John 9 and verse 30? Yeah. So what does that assume or imply about where he thinks he's from? It must be from God. God must somehow be endowing him with some sort of supernatural power. And so he's gone from a man to a prophet and to someone who has come from God. And then Jesus appears to him and speaks to him in verse 38. And what does he call Jesus in verse 38? Lord. Lord, I believe. And we ought to go through that same process of belief. We have to consider the signs and consider the evidence. And we have to move from just that, this is just Jesus of Nazareth, to the fact that this is Jesus, the Son of God. And there's no way he could have done these things that he's done without being a true power from God. All right, so they brought the man. This is what Barclay writes. They brought the man and examined him. And when he was asked his opinion of Jesus, he gave it without hesitation. He said that Jesus was a prophet. Barclay notes this. He says, in the Old Testament, a prophet was often tested by the signs he could produce. So Moses guaranteed to Pharaoh that he really was God's messenger by the signs and the wonders which he performed. In Exodus 4, for example, Elijah proved that he was the prophet of the real God by doing things the prophet of Baal could not do in 1 Kings 18. And no doubt this man's thoughts were running on these things when he said that in his opinion, Jesus was a prophet. I think it indicates something about the fact that this man was somewhat educated in Scripture and had some sort of Old Testament knowledge. And so he makes a conclusion that because of the sign, Jesus must be a prophet. But Jesus was greater than that. This miracle finds a response of both belief and unbelief, as most of the miracles do. So what's the goal? Just reminding ourselves, what's the goal of John recording these signs? So that you may believe in John 20. And who specifically becomes a believer in this text? The blind man. The blind man becomes a believer. In John 9, 30 through 33, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And Lord, I believe. Now, what did Isaiah specifically predicted that is fulfilled here? What's Isaiah 35? Can anybody turn to Isaiah 35, read verses 5 and 6 for us, which is a passage Jesus quotes in Matthew 11 and verse 5. Isaiah 35, 5 and 6.
Then the eyes of the blind will be open and the ears of the deaf will be unstopped. And 6.
Mm-hmm.
Then the lame will leap like a deer and the tongue of the mute will shout for joy. For the waters will break forth in the wilderness and the streams in the Arba.
All right, so Isaiah is prophesying this day would come when the Messiah was here, when the eyes of the blind would be opened. All right, Matthew chapter 11 and verse 5. What does Jesus say? Clay, you have that?
The blind see and the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear, the dead are raised up and the poor have the gospel preached to them.
Okay, and so another reason why John would have documented this example of the man being born blind who can now see, was it would also be a fulfillment of prophecy in the eyes of those who were familiar with the Old Testament and the eyes of those who would have read that. That's why Jesus sent to the disciples of John, he tells people to go back and say, tell John that, the deaf hear and the blind see and the lame walk. Because it was a fulfillment of Isaiah 35, which was a fulfillment of the Messiah being here on earth. All right. Well, sadly, the religious leaders, the Pharisees, they never seem to follow the evidence where it leads. So what were the factors which hindered their belief in Jesus? Because there are reasons sometimes why people don't want to admit they believe or confess they believe or become believers. So what were some of those things for the Pharisees? He looked like a man? And they thought that of Jesus? Is that what you're saying? Okay. That could be something that's tripping them up, yeah. In the text, what do you see in John 9 and verse 14?
He's a lawbreaker.
He's a lawbreaker, okay. They have an extreme view of the Sabbath day. Because of their extreme view of the Sabbath day, they come to the conclusion anybody that's breaking our traditions on the Sabbath certainly can't be somebody we would want to believe in, right? They're breaking his traditions. All right, verse 18, what would be, it says, the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight. So one of the reasons is they just don't believe that, they thought the guy was lying at first. What proves that wrong? His parents. Yeah, they bring the parents in, and the parents say, yeah, he was blind. And so you can't use that excuse anymore. So I love how John kind of, as he works through it, he tries to eliminate some of the excuses that they could have had. All right, John 9 and verse 22. Why do the parents never come out and say anything about Jesus openly?
They would be considered apostates.
They're scared of the Jews. They would have been considered apostates. They'd be kicked out of the synagogue. So we're not going to follow the truth where it leads because we have these intimidating rulers that will kick us out if we actually were to confess the Christ.
Well, and this shows us that the Jews had already made up their mind, really, no matter what they saw, they weren't going to believe he was the Christ. They had already determined that.
Yeah. And they were operating at this point by bullying and by threats and coercion. And so you have a scared people. And I think that's why Jesus says what he does about them in John 10. You're a bunch of thieves and robbers and a bunch of gangsters. You're using a mob mentality to try to run things, which is denying people the opportunity to follow the truth where it leads. All right, John 9 and verse 24.
Question the blind man a second time.
Okay.
Talk to him again.
They're questioning him a second time. You feel like they're trying to feed him a line there too? We know that this man is a sinner. Just agree with us, okay? I don't know if he's a sinner or not, the blind man says. All I know is that I couldn't see before and I see now. So I'm not going to swallow what you're feeding me and repeat it. But that's what they're trying to do. Just say this and then you'll be okay with us. We'll let you go. But he doesn't do that. He doesn't just repeat the lines that they want him to repeat.
But I think their predominance is shifting because the blind man has not buckled, and I think they're desperate.
Yeah, that's a good point. Desperation mode. So John 9, 28 and 29.
They don't believe he's from God.
Okay. We know that God spoke to Moses. We don't know where he is from. What's the word that's used in verse 28, the verb that's used to describe what they do? Ridicule. They ridicule him. They revile him. And so they don't believe him. They lie about Jesus. They're feeding him the answers that they want to hear. They're ridiculing him and reviling him. And this is how the leaders of the Jews are functioning. And this is why when Jesus comes to the people, one of the things that he says, I think this is Matthew 9, it says that he has compassion on them because they're like sheep having no shepherd. They really don't have good shepherds who genuinely care about them. This is demonstrating you really don't care because of the way that you're treating this man. John 9 and verse 34, where do they, how does this all end up?
Well, we're masters of the law, and this one man's trying to teach us,
Yeah, we're the rabbis here, and so if you're going to disagree with us, then you just go, even though what you're stating is truth. And so all they can do now is just kick him out. So they kick him out of the synagogue, which is kind of the final straw. We just don't want to hear from you anymore. So it's easier just to not deal with you and kick you out. So all these things are hindering their belief in Jesus and their evidence of their denial of the evidence for Jesus.
Hey, Josh?
Yeah.
It goes into chapter 10 about the thieves and robbers. I think one thing, and we've said this before, like, this is a power struggle. This is a lot of money that's coming out of their pockets.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of power that's leaving them.
Yeah.
So, when you start affecting people's living and money, they're really going to dig in. Whether they believe it or not. I mean, they can't deny what they saw.
For sure. By the way, one of the things that happens in between this and what we've been studying that we noted in the map is they asked a question about the temple tax. And you mentioned the money being a concern. It's interesting that that's a question they ask. Are you paying the temple tax? And so he's like, well, last time I checked, the sons of the king, the family of the king doesn't have to pay the temple tax. That's something that we do to strangers. Since I am the God of the temple, I don't think I should have to pay the temple tax. But he goes and gets a fish, and that'd be awesome if we could pay our taxes by going fishing. But he goes and gets a fish, and the temple tax comes out. But you're right to say this has a little bit to do with money here, and that's part of the power struggle.
It's not fishy about that.
Nice. Okay. Some of the Pharisees wanted to hold to their traditions. Others are willing to follow the evidence where it leads. So what's the consequence in John 9 and verse 16? Division. Yeah, there's a division among the people. And you're going to see that same sort of division. People are thinking, well, hold on. This seems pretty obvious. He was blind, now he sees. And so that must indicate something about Jesus. But then there's people denying the evidence. And so, well, no, we can't believe in Jesus. He's breaking the Sabbath. That's not possible. And so you see division starting to happen. You're starting to see a break between the people who believe and the people who don't believe. Why did more people not openly speak up for Jesus with such convicting evidence? A man born blind, confirmed by the neighbors, by the disciples, by the parents, by the man himself, and yet will not follow the evidence where it leads. What are some of the key factors? What's that? They're scared of what would happen to them. Yeah. You see that in John 12. We're going to look at this in a couple weeks. But John 12, verse 42, says, even among the rulers, many believed in him. So even perhaps some of these same people who are questioning him right now, even among the rulers, many believed in him. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. It's all about politics. It's politics. And that cowardly belief isn't
Being put out
belief.
of synagogue was a big thing religiously for them because they couldn't go and worship. But wasn't that also kind of had them excluded from the community and affected business and people not associated with them and more than just what we all think about, well, you can't come here anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a good point too. They would have been, in a sense, excommunicated from people in the community, which affects more than just coming to synagogue worship. Yeah. So there's high stakes, in a sense, to follow Jesus. And that's, when you get to Hebrews, look at Hebrews chapter, I think it's chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. When the Hebrew writer writes, what's actually chapter 10? I was right when I started, sort of. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32, he says, recall the former days. So these are Hebrews. These are people that would have been Jews. These are people that may have been the very witnesses of events like these, signs like these. Recall the former days in which after you were illuminated, you endured a great struggle with sufferings, partly while you were made a spectacle by reproaches and tribulations, and partly while you became companions of those who were so treated, like the blind man. For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven. Paul, the author here, I said Paul, but we don't know if Paul's the author or not, but the author of Hebrews is admitting that for people to have converted to Jesus, they gave up. They gave up money, they gave up friendships, they made huge sacrifices in order to follow Jesus. And he's asking them to remember why they did that, because you follow the evidence where it leads. And he's asking them not to draw back, but to realize there's something better ahead of you, but you're going to have to suffer and endure trials while you wait for that. Mm-hmm.
I think the Pharisees would be the equivalent of the Taliban today. They are the enforcers of their own traditions, and they're the police. They are the theological police.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I mean, there's people that... I know a young man that converted from Islam to Christianity, and to do it, he had to leave Egypt and he had to come to the United States, and he could never go back to Egypt again because his entire family is Muslim. They would have killed him if he would have gone back to Egypt and found out that he converted. He had to get out of the country and get free from all of that in order to follow Jesus, because that's how severe the threats are. People make great sacrifices to follow Jesus, and sometimes they don't get to leave the country, and sometimes they do lose their lives in those situations. That's an interesting comparison. All right, so you think about the action of the Pharisees toward the blind man, and then let's think about the reaction of Jesus, because to me this is where Jesus really shines, where he is so much different than the mocking, ridiculing, insulting, power-hungry Pharisees. So what does Jesus do in John 9:34 through 38? Jesus hears that he's been cast out, and does he just say, well, that's too bad? That poor guy, sorry about his luck. What's Jesus do? He finds him. In John 9, verse 35, it says, when he had found him, which suggests Jesus was looking for him. He knows this guy is hurt and he's broken, and everybody should be rejoicing with him, and yet he just got kicked out of the synagogue. It becomes the best and the worst day of his life. So he found him, and he said, do you believe in the Son of God? And he answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. So Jesus reveals himself to him. And he said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. And Jesus basically tells him, I came so that blind people like you can truly see, and there are some people who can see, but they don't really see, right? And then he goes into his Good Shepherd speech, which sets up that discourse. Treat people like Jesus. I guess that's the ultimate point, isn't it? Treat people with compassion, with kindness, with love and grace like Jesus does. Because it's a huge contrast from the way the world a lot of times treats people, treats us. All right, thanks.